Hey guys, so 87 days now since Nancy Guthrie literally just vanished out of her home right up the driveway there. No one seems to know where Nancy is. Been talking to the neighbors who are worried that this is going to go unsolved. That's their main concern right now, that this case will not be solved.
Brian Entin did not go to the Catalina Foothills neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona to stand outside Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive. He did not go to the Pima County Sheriff's Department on Benson Highway to wait for a press conference that would never say enough. He went somewhere nobody expected. He went to the property connected to the man investigators have been examining since the very first week of this case. He walked toward that address in the Tucson foothills, stood where law enforcement had stood, watched what was happening inside, and what Brian Entin documented at that location, what he described to a national audience on News Nation, is something that once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear. This is day 86 of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. This is the video nobody else is making. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe right now. Hit the like button. And at the end of everything you are about to hear, drop a comment and tell me, what do you think investigators found inside that home? I want to know what you think. Now let's go. For the first several weeks after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, the public conversation was locked onto the physical evidence. The blood on the front doorstep. The doorbell camera ripped from the wall at 1:47 in the morning. The pacemaker monitor that missed its transmission at 2:28 a.m. The unprotected crime scene that the Pima County Sheriff's Department left open and accessible for days while a camera crew walked freely through what should have been the most protected piece of real estate in southern Arizona. Everyone was talking about the what, the when, the how. But there was a who that wasn't being discussed openly in those early weeks. A name that sat at the absolute center of this investigation like a stone dropped in still water. Present, visible, creating ripples in every direction, and yet somehow not examined with the full weight the public deserved. That name is Tommaso Caione. And before we talk about what Brian Entin found inside the property connected to him, before we get to what investigators removed from that address and why it matters, you need to understand exactly who Tommaso Caione is. Because most people following this case have not heard the complete picture. Tommaso Caione is not a stranger to the Guthrie family. He is not a neighbor. He is not someone who crossed paths with Nancy Guthrie in a parking lot near her home in the Catalina Foothills or at a store along Oracle Road. Tommaso Caione is Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. He is married to Annie Guthrie, the sister of Savannah Guthrie, the nationally known anchor of NBC's Today Show. One of the women who loves Nancy Guthrie most in this world is married to the man whose name sits at the center of a federal missing persons investigation. And Tommaso Caione was the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. On the night of January 31st, 2026, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Tommaso Caione dropped Nancy Guthrie off at her home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills. He was with her. He stood at that address. He watched her go inside. And then Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was taken from her bed in the dark less than 4 hours later. That single fact, that the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive before her abduction was a member of her own family, her own son-in-law, reframes every other piece of evidence in this case. Every photograph, every timestamp, every digital record, every item that investigators would later remove from a property connected to Tommaso Caione while Brian Entin stood outside and watched. Brian Entin does not wait for press releases. He does not anchor himself to a studio desk in New York or Washington and read wire copy about a case unfolding 2,000 miles away in Tucson, Arizona. He does not hold for the official statement. He does not defer to what the Pima County Sheriff's Department wants the public to know versus what is actually happening on the ground. Every person who has followed this case since February 1st, 2026, knows that Brian Entin operates differently from almost every other reporter covering major crime stories in America. He goes to the place. He knocks on the door. He stands on the sidewalk outside the property and he stays. He watches what law enforcement is doing with his own eyes and he reports what he sees in real time. Not what the department is prepared to confirm, not what the official spokesperson has cleared for release, but what is physically happening at the location he is standing at. When investigative activity began at the property in Tucson connected to Tommaso Caione, Brian Entin was already there. He watched from outside the address. He documented the movement of investigators in and out of the structure. He observed which areas of the property received the most sustained attention. He watched what went in and he watched what came out. And everything he documented, he reported live to a national audience through News Nation. The picture that emerged from his presence at that address was deeply, profoundly disturbing. If you are just finding this channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. New developments in this case are moving fast and you do not want to miss what is coming. To understand the full weight of what Brian Entin documented at the suspect's property in Tucson, you need to understand the geography of this investigation. 3 locations, 3 addresses, 3 physical spaces connected by blood, by family, and by the events of the early morning hours of February 1, 2026 in the Catalina Foothills. The first location is Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson. The place where blood was found on the front doorstep, where a masked, gloved, armed figure removed the doorbell camera from the wall at 1:47 a.m., where an 84-year-old woman was taken from her bed and has not been seen since. The second location is the property in Tucson connected to Tommaso Caione, the address Brian Entin went to, the address where investigators arrived with a specific operational focus, the address from which items were removed and processed as part of the federal evidence chain. The third location is the Tucson area home of Annie Guthrie, Savannah Guthrie's sister, Tommaso Caione's wife, Nancy Guthrie's daughter, a home that belongs to the family at the center of this case. Brian Entin was not at one of these locations. He was watching all 3. He documented law enforcement activity at Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive. He documented the investigative operation at the property connected to the suspect. And he documented police presence at the residence connected to Annie Guthrie. The fact that investigators were simultaneously active at 3 connected addresses in Tucson, all on the same day, all with visible and sustained law enforcement presence, told Brian Entin something that no press conference was going to say out loud. This was not a routine follow-up visit. This was a coordinated operation. Multiple locations being worked at the same time by investigators who had reached a point in their analysis where physical spaces needed to be re-examined in the light of new evidence. And at the property connected to Tommaso Caione, what they found inside was not what anyone had been publicly prepared to hear. The reporting on what investigators removed from the property connected to Tommaso Caione has been careful, deliberately careful, because this is an active federal investigation, and the specific contents of what was found are part of an evidence chain that prosecutors will one day need to present in a federal courtroom. But what Brian Entin witnessed outside that Tucson address, combined with what has emerged through News Nation and other credible reporting, paints a picture that is impossible to walk away from. Items were removed from the property. Not incidentally. Not in the casual, sweeping way that happens when investigators do a preliminary look at a secondary location and gather a few items for completeness. Items were removed in a way that indicated investigators arrived at that address with specific intelligence about what they were looking for and found it. The areas of the home that received the most sustained investigative attention. The pattern of movement in and out of the property. The specific focus of the search. All of it pointed toward a person who had not simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It pointed toward a person who had in their possession materials, items, or information that connected directly to what happened to Nancy Guthrie on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills in the early morning hours of February 1, 2026. Brian Entin, a reporter who has covered violent crime, federal investigations, and missing persons cases across this country for years, described what he witnessed at that property as disturbing. When a journalist who has stood outside crime scenes in cities from Miami to Los Angeles, who has watched federal investigators work dozens of major cases, chooses the word disturbing to describe what he observed at an address in Tucson, Arizona, that word carries weight that a press release never could. Now let us build the timeline. Because the sequence of events involving Tommaso Caione in the hours surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is something every person following this case needs to hold completely in their mind. 9:50 p.m., January 31, 2026. Tommaso Caione drops Nancy Guthrie off at her home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. This is the last confirmed interaction between Nancy Guthrie and any known person before her disappearance. He was with her. He was at her home. He knew the address. He knew the layout. He had been inside that house before as a member of the family. 1:47 a.m. February 1st, 2026. A masked, gloved, armed figure appears at the front doorstep of Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive and physically removes the doorbell camera from the wall. The window between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. is 3 hours and 57 minutes. Nearly 4 hours between the moment Tommaso Cioni last stood at Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive and the moment a masked figure arrived to take her. 4 hours is enough time to drive across Tucson and back. 4 hours is enough time to change clothes, gather materials, plan a final approach to a property you already know by heart. 4 hours is a timeline that the FBI has examined in extraordinary detail. 2:28 a.m. The pacemaker monitor beside Nancy Guthrie's bed missed its scheduled transmission. She was already gone. If this video is giving you the full picture you have not found anywhere else, like this video right now, it tells the algorithm that this story matters and it gets this information in front of more people who deserve to know what is happening in Tucson. Here is a detail that takes on an entirely different dimension when placed against Tommaso Cioni's relationship to Nancy Guthrie and her home on East Skyline Drive. Investigators developed a theory during the course of this investigation that whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina Foothills on the morning of February 1st may have used a signal jamming device, specialized electronic equipment designed to block wireless communications, to prevent the Google Nest doorbell camera from transmitting live footage, to neutralize the security systems that should have been sending alerts the moment anything moved on that doorstep. Signal jammers are not something a person acquires impulsively. They are not items that appear in someone's hands the night of a crime because they wandered into an electronics store and made an impulse purchase. They require research. They require procurement. They require deliberate, advanced planning from a person who knows specifically that a wireless security system exists at the location they intend to enter, and who knows they need to defeat it before they arrive. Now ask yourself, who knew Nancy Guthrie had a Google Nest doorbell camera on her front door at her home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills? Who knew she had wireless security systems that transmitted in real time? Who knew the layout of that home, the entry points, the hallways, the location of her bedroom, the position of the pacemaker monitor beside the bed, well enough to navigate it in the dark at 1:47 in the morning wearing a mask and gloves? A son-in-law who had walked through those rooms, who had stood at that front door, who had been dropped off and picked up at that address, who had passed by that doorbell camera dozens of times as a trusted member of the family. The signal jammer theory, applied to a complete stranger, describes a sophisticated criminal who did extensive research on a random target. Applied to someone who already knew every inch of that property, it describes something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more disturbing. Investigators identified something chilling in the digital records surrounding Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson. Image searches were conducted specifically for Nancy Guthrie's home address. In March of 2025, 10 months before she disappeared, and again between November 30th and December 1st of 2025, 60 days before she was taken. Someone was sitting at a device, typing the address of an 84-year-old woman's home into Google Images and studying photographs of the exterior of that property from publicly available sources. 2 rounds of digital reconnaissance. 10 months out, 60 days out. Now consider who needed to conduct that reconnaissance and who did not. A complete stranger to Nancy Guthrie, unfamiliar with her home, would need to research that address. They would need to look at photographs of the property, study the exterior, understand the entry points and the sight lines and the approach angles that a masked figure arriving at 1:47 in the morning would need to know in advance. For a complete stranger, those searches make a certain kind of terrible sense. But a son-in-law who had been to that home, who had stood at that front door, who knew what the property looked like from the street, from the driveway, from every angle that a person who had visited dozens of times would already have committed to memory. Why would that person need to search Google Images for photographs of an address they already knew by heart? Unless those searches were not about learning what the property looked like. Unless they were about confirming something specific, the camera position, the sight lines from East Skyline Drive, the approach angles in the dark. The FBI subpoenaed Google for the IP address data connected to those searches. The device, the account, the digital trail from March 2025 and from the final days of November 2025. That data is now in the FBI's hands. The ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case have always been among the most puzzling elements of this investigation. Multiple notes, sent not just to the Guthrie family but to law enforcement and to media outlets, to national broadcast networks, to news organizations, to the public channels of an investigation already being watched by millions of people across the country. The notes demanded payment. They set deadlines. They applied pressure through public media in a way that suggested the person writing them understood exactly how a family like this would respond to that kind of exposure. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, the NBC Today anchor who has appeared publicly throughout this investigation, said she believed at least some of the ransom notes were legitimate, that they came from whoever had her mother. Now consider what writing those notes required. If you are a stranger to this family, you need to know who to address. You need to know what their resources look like. You need to understand whether they would go immediately to the FBI or attempt to handle the situation privately. You need to know how to construct a demand that creates the maximum possible pressure on the people most likely to act. Or you already know all of that, because you have sat at the same dinner table. Because you know exactly how Savannah Guthrie operates, what she values, what she would do the moment her mother's life was threatened. Because you have been inside this family's life for years. The behavioral experts who analyzed the ransom notes in this case, as reported through Brian Entin's coverage on News Nation, described the author as someone with intimate knowledge of the target family, not the generic demands of a stranger kidnapper. Targeted communication, precise psychological pressure, applied by someone who understood the family's dynamics from the inside. Share this video right now with anyone you know who has been following the Nancy Guthrie case. Every share puts this information in front of someone who deserves to have it. The algorithm works when you do. Share it. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit completed a psychological profile of whoever abducted Nancy Guthrie from her home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson on the morning of February 1, 2026. That profile describes someone with specific, prior, detailed knowledge of the target and her property. Consistent. Someone with above-average intelligence, capable of sustained long-term planning across months, not weeks. The Google image searches in March of 2025. The second round of digital reconnaissance in late November. The signal jammer. The propped rear entry points. The precision of the 1:47 a.m. approach. All of it consistent. Someone who understood the target family structure well enough to construct ransom demands that applied maximum psychological pressure on the people most likely to respond. A person inside that family would understand that better than anyone alive. Consistent. Someone whose movement through the property on the night of the abduction reflected familiarity. Who moved through Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive with the confidence of a person who had been there before, who knew the layout without needing to learn it in the dark. Consistent. An FBI profiler who sat down with Brian Entin to discuss the psychological state of whoever committed this crime said something that everyone following this case needs to hear. They said that at this stage of the investigation, with DNA evidence at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, with the search of the suspect's property complete, with national media attention focused on this case every single day, the person responsible is experiencing extreme psychological pressure. And a person of this profile, under this level of sustained stress, tends to make errors. Errors that leave new evidence. Errors that give investigators something they did not have before. The walls are closing in Tucson, Arizona. And whoever is inside them knows it. After 86 days, here is the honest, complete picture of where this investigation stands. The DNA collected from inside Nancy Guthrie's home on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills is at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. It is being processed through probabilistic genotyping software. It is being prepared for comparison through the federal CODIS database. It is being readied for the genetic genealogy pipeline that has solved cold cases and active investigations across the country. The cell tower data being assembled by the FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey team is mapping the complete digital footprint of every mobile device active in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood on the night of January 31st and the morning of February 1st, 2026, including the footprint of a son-in-law who was at that address that very evening. The Google subpoena has placed the IP address records from the image searches of Nancy Guthrie's home from March 2025 and from late November 2025 directly into the FBI's hands. The items removed from the suspect's property in Tucson during the search that Brian Entin documented from outside that address are being analyzed as part of the federal evidence package. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, whose early failures compromised the first critical days of this investigation, whose leadership blocked FBI access to Quantico resources for 10 weeks, whose Sheriff Richard Nanos faced a public call for resignation from the county's own Board of Supervisors, who was questioned under oath again on April 21st, is now operating in a fundamentally different relationship with federal investigators. The evidence is at Quantico. The searches are being conducted. The cooperation that should have existed on February 1st, 2026, is finally grudgingly in place. And the behavioral profile, the psychological portrait of a person who planned this across 10 months, who executed it with precision in the dark hours of a February morning, who wrote ransom notes that reflected intimate knowledge of the Guthrie family's internal dynamics, who propped open rear entry points and removed a doorbell camera and arrived at 1:47 a.m. with a signal jamming device and a firearm. That profile is in the hands of investigators who are now pulling every thread at the same time. Nancy Guthrie is still waiting. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 86 days. She is 84 years old. She lived in a home she loved on East Skyline Drive in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona. A home her family knew. A home she returned to on the last night anyone saw her alive, carried there by a member of her own family. Her daughter Savannah Guthrie has appeared in public throughout this investigation. She has not given up. She has put up $1 million of her own money as a reward for information leading to her mother's safe return. She has spoken about her mother with the love of a daughter who refuses to accept an ending that has not yet been written. Somewhere tonight, in Tucson or somewhere far from Tucson, an 84-year-old woman is waiting for someone to care enough to find her. Brian Entin has not left this story. The FBI is processing evidence that will speak when the time comes. And this channel will be here every single day that Nancy Guthrie remains missing, because this is the video nobody else is making, and she deserves for someone to keep making it. Subscribe if you are not already here. Share this with everyone following this case. The investigation is not over. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. And neither is this one. This script is based on publicly reported information from News Nation, Brian Entin's on-the-ground reporting, and publicly available court and investigative records. No guilt has been legally established against any named individual. All persons named are presumed innocent unless proven otherwise in a court of law.